The alien princess stood alone in the shadowed alcove of her throne room, veiled from head to toe in shimmering fabric that caught the faintest light. Her presence was regal, her posture unwavering, yet an air of melancholy clung to her. She was the heir to the Cyrathian Empire, a civilization spanning countless systems. But among her people, she was considered cursed. Born under the twin moons during an eclipse, an event steeped in superstition, the princess was destined for isolation. Cyrathian tradition dictated that her face, marked with the celestial blessing of the eclipse, could only be revealed to her bonded partner, someone willing to share her fate and endure the risks of the unknown. None of her people dared to take that step, fearing the curse might spill over onto them. Her parents, the Emperor and Empress, had issued a desperate plea across the galaxy. They sought a champion, a warrior, or a soul brave enough to bond with their daughter and secure the future of the Empire. Weeks turned into months, and then into years. The call went unanswered. It was on a war-torn frontier world that Sergeant Erik Voss first heard the tale of the Cyrathian princess. A grizzled human soldier, Erik was no stranger to danger. He had survived countless battles, fought under the harshest conditions, and faced horrors that had claimed many of his comrades. Yet, as he sat in a dimly lit cantina surrounded by the chaos of the galaxy's never-ending conflicts, the story of the veiled princess piqued his curiosity. "She's not just veiled," an alien merchant said, leaning across the table. His multi-limbed form cast flickering shadows against the cantina's walls. "The curse. It said that anyone who looks upon her face without bonding will be consumed by madness." Erik raised an eyebrow. "Madness, you say? Sounds like superstition." The merchant clicked its mandibles in annoyance. "Superstition or not, it's kept her unbonded for decades. Her empire's in peril. They need a bond to stabilize the succession." Erik took a sip of his drink, considering the merchant's words. He had no love for imperial politics, but something about the tale struck a chord. Perhaps it was the challenge, or perhaps it was the faintest trace of sympathy for someone condemned by circumstances beyond their control. The next day, Erik put in his resignation from the mercenary company he'd been serving with and booked passage to Cyrathia. The Cyrathian capital was a marvel, a city of floating spires and crystalline bridges suspended in the clouds of a gas giant. Yet, despite its beauty, Erik could sense the tension in the air. The people eyed him warily as he strode through the imperial palace, escorted by a pair of guards whose ornate armor did little to hide their unease. In the throne room, the Emperor and Empress regarded Erik with a mixture of hope and desperation. The princess stood to the side, her veiled figure as still as a statue. Erik met their gazes one by one, his expression steady. "I've heard your call," he said. "I'll bond with the princess." A collective gasp echoed through the chamber. The Empress stepped forward, her voice trembling. "You understand the risk? The curse?" "Your Highness," Erik interrupted gently, "I've faced death more times than I can count. If madness is the price for helping someone who's been abandoned by her own people, so be it." The princess shifted slightly, the first movement Erik had seen from her. It was subtle, but it spoke volumes. Perhaps she, too, was surprised by his words. The bonding ceremony was scheduled for the following day. It was a simple yet profound ritual, requiring both participants to share a moment of complete vulnerability. Erik knew little of Cyrathian customs, but he resolved to face whatever lay ahead with the same courage that had carried him through countless battles. When the time came, Erik and the princess stood in a secluded garden beneath the glowing orbs of Cyrathia's twin moons. The air was thick with anticipation. The ritual began with an exchange of vows, spoken in the melodic Cyrathian tongue. Erik repeated the words as best he could, his voice steady despite his unfamiliarity with the language. Then came the final step, the unveiling. The princess hesitated, her hands trembling as they reached for the edges of her veil. Erik noticed the tension in her posture, the way her shoulders seemed to carry the weight of the galaxy. He took a step closer, his voice soft. "You don't have to be afraid." Her hands paused. Slowly, she lowered the veil, revealing her face. Erik's breath caught. Her features were alien yet striking, her skin shimmering with an otherworldly iridescence. But what stood out most were her eyes, vast, luminous orbs filled with a depth of emotion that transcended words. In them, Erik saw pain, hope, and an unyielding strength. He felt no madness, no curse, only an overwhelming sense of connection. "I see you," he said simply. The princess's lips parted, a single tear escaping down her cheek. For the first time in her life, she was truly seen, not as a cursed heir or a symbol of misfortune, but as herself. Their bond ignited like a starburst, a radiant light enveloping them both. Erik felt a surge of energy, a mingling of their essences that left him breathless. He knew, in that moment, that their lives were irrevocably intertwined. But as the light faded, a shadow loomed over the garden. Unseen forces had been watching, waiting for this moment. The princess's curse was not mere superstition, it was the mark of an ancient enemy, one that would stop at nothing to claim her. Erik and the princess had taken their first step together, but their journey was far from over. The shadow that loomed over the garden solidified into a palpable presence. Erik's warrior instincts kicked in immediately. His hand went to the hilt of the blade strapped to his side, a precaution he rarely left behind, even on alien worlds. The princess gasped, her iridescent skin pulsing faintly as she stumbled back. Erik placed himself between her and the encroaching threat. From the darkness emerged a figure clad in jagged black armor, its surface seeming to writhe like a living organism. It was humanoid but distorted, with limbs that bent unnaturally and a head that lacked any discernible features save for a single, glowing crimson eye. The figure exuded an aura of malice that made the air around it heavy and oppressive. "You have interfered," the figure hissed, its voice echoing like a chorus of whispers. "The curse was meant to isolate her. You have broken the seal." Erik tightened his grip on his blade. "Seal or no seal, she's not facing you alone." The princess's trembling voice cut through the tension. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure ignored her, its crimson eye fixed on Erik. "Human," it said, the word dripping with disdain. "Do you understand what you've done? By bonding with her, you have awakened forces beyond your comprehension. Forces that will consume you both." Erik smirked, though his muscles were coiled, ready for action. "You'd be surprised how much I can handle." The figure raised a clawed hand, and a wave of energy shot toward Erik. He dodged, rolling to the side and slashing at the figure with his blade. The metal struck true but glanced off the armor with a sharp clang. The figure retaliated, its movements unnaturally fast, forcing Erik into a desperate dance to avoid being skewered. The princess watched in horror, her mind racing. She felt the bond between her and Erik like a living thread, pulsating with shared energy. She didn't fully understand its potential, but instinct told her it was their only chance. Closing her eyes, she reached out through the bond, her thoughts brushing against Erik's like a whisper in the dark. "Erik, I can help you." His voice came back, steady and calm despite the chaos. "Do it." She focused, drawing on the connection between them. A surge of warmth flooded Erik's body, and suddenly, he moved with a speed and precision that mirrored the figure's. His blade glowed faintly, infused with the energy she was channeling into him. The tide of the battle shifted. Erik pressed the attack, his enhanced movements catching the figure off guard. With a powerful strike, he severed one of its clawed limbs. The figure screeched, a sound that echoed like 1,000 voices in agony, and dissolved into a swirling mass of shadow before vanishing completely. Silence fell over the garden, broken only by the princess's ragged breathing. Erik turned to her, his expression softening as he approached. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, though her hands were still trembling. That was no ordinary enemy. It felt ancient, like it had been waiting for this moment. Erik sheathed his blade, his jaw tightening. "Then we'd better be ready. Whatever that thing was, it's not going to give up easily." Back in the palace, the Emperor and Empress were horrified to learn of the attack. The Emperor summoned his council, their hushed voices filling the grand chamber as they debated the implications. "It must be them," one advisor said, his face pale. "The Shadreth. They've returned." The princess, standing beside Erik, felt a chill run down her spine. The Shadreth were the oldest enemy of her people, a race of beings that had been banished to the void millennia ago. Their hatred for the Cyrathians burned eternal, and their return spelled disaster. "We don't have time for debate," Erik said, cutting through the council's murmurs. They came for her once. They'll come again. The Emperor's gaze hardened. You speak boldly for an outsider. Erik met his gaze without flinching. I'm bonded to her now. That makes this my fight too. The room fell silent. The Empress, her face lined with worry, stepped forward. If the Shadreth have truly returned, we must act swiftly. The bond between you two is our only hope. The princess turned to Erik, her voice trembling but determined. We need to understand this bond. Its power. It's the key to defeating them. Erik nodded. Then let's find out what it can do. The days that followed were grueling. The princess and Erik trained together, exploring the depths of their bond. It was more than a mere connection. It was a fusion of their strengths, their emotions, and their very beings. Through it, Erik gained an uncanny intuition, able to anticipate the princess's thoughts and movements. She, in turn, drew courage and focus from his unyielding resolve. But the bond was not without its challenges. The deeper they delved, the more they uncovered memories and fears they had never intended to share. Erik saw glimpses of the princess's lonely childhood, the weight of her curse, and the heartbreak of being shunned by her people. She, in turn, saw the battles Erik had fought, the comrades he had lost, and the lingering guilt that haunted him. You've been through so much, she whispered one evening as they sat in the palace's observatory, the stars stretching endlessly before them. So have you, he replied, his voice soft. But we're here now. And whatever comes, we face it together. Their moment of peace was short-lived. Alarms blared through the palace, and a guard burst into the room. The Shadreth are attacking the outer colonies, the guard exclaimed. Their fleet is massive. The princess stood, her resolve hardening. We have to go. The bond's power. It's our best chance. Erik rose beside her, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. Then let's show them what we're made of. Together, they stepped into the unknown, their bond a beacon of hope in the face of the growing darkness. The Cyrathian fleet mobilized with urgency. From the massive hangars of the Imperial Palace, sleek warships emerged, their crystalline hulls shimmering with the light of 1,000 stars. Erik stood on the bridge of the flagship, the Ecliptica, alongside the princess. She was no longer veiled, her face now a symbol of defiance and hope for the soldiers who would fight under her command. The bond between them had deepened, and with it came an unspoken understanding. They were partners in this battle, their fates entwined. Erik's experience as a warrior was invaluable to the Cyrathian forces, and the princess's connection to the bond infused their strategies with an almost preternatural foresight. Shadreth ships are advancing on the colony of Xylith Prime, reported a young officer, his scaled hands trembling as he pointed to the holographic map. Their numbers are overwhelming. Erik studied the display, his brow furrowed. They're testing us. They'll hit Xylith Prime hard to see how we respond. The princess nodded, her voice calm despite the tension in the room. We can't abandon the colony. But if we move too soon, we risk walking into a trap. Erik glanced at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. I've got an idea. The strategy he proposed was unconventional, a calculated risk that relied on their bond to outmaneuver the enemy. The Cyrathian Council was skeptical, but the princess backed Erik's plan without hesitation. The Ecliptica arrived at Xylith Prime to find the colony under siege. Shadreth ships, dark and jagged, surrounded the planet, their weapons tearing through Cyrathian defenses. The skies burned with streaks of energy as the battle raged. Erik and the princess moved to the command deck, where they synchronized through the bond. She closed her eyes, focusing on the threads of energy that connected them. Erik felt her presence like a steady flame in his mind, guiding him. Fleet, execute Formation Delta 7, the princess commanded, her voice amplified through the ship's comms. Erik, they'll target our forward line first. Already on it, he replied, directing the Cyrathian interceptors to shield the vulnerable cruisers. The Shadreth forces responded with brutal efficiency, but Erik's instincts and the princess's foresight kept their fleet one step ahead. Through the bond, Erik could sense the flow of the battle. Every move the enemy made felt like ripples in a pond. He guided the Cyrathian ships with precision, exploiting weaknesses in the Shadreth formation. They're regrouping, the princess said, her eyes snapping open. They're about to launch an overwhelming assault. Erik grinned. Let them. That's exactly what we're counting on. As the Shadreth ships converged, the Ecliptica unleashed its secret weapon, a resonance pulse, amplified by the bond. The energy rippled through space, disrupting the Shadreth ship systems. Their formation crumbled, and the Cyrathian fleet seized the opportunity to strike. The battle ended with a decisive victory for the Cyrathians, but Erik and the princess knew it was only the beginning. Back aboard the Ecliptica, Erik leaned against the railing of the observation deck, staring out at the stars. The princess joined him, her presence a quiet comfort. "We won," she said softly. "Yeah," Erik replied. "But they'll be back." She nodded, her gaze distant. "The Shadreth are relentless. They won't stop until they've destroyed everything." Erik turned to her, his expression serious. "Then we won't stop either. Whatever it takes, we'll keep fighting." The bond between them flared briefly, a pulse of warmth that reassured them both. But it wasn't just a tool for battle. It was a connection that went deeper than either of them fully understood. As the days turned into weeks, Erik and the princess delved into the mysteries of the Shadreth. Ancient Cyrathian records revealed that the Shadreth were not merely enemies. They were once allies, betrayed by the Empire in a conflict lost to time. Their hatred was born of vengeance, fueled by centuries of exile in the void. They were cast out because of their connection to the Voidstream, the princess explained during one of their study sessions. It's an energy source that exists outside of time and space. Dangerous and unstable. Erik frowned. "Sounds like they've mastered it." She nodded grimly. "And they'll use it to destroy us." The revelation added new urgency to their mission. The bond had shown signs of resonating with the Voidstream's energy, hinting at a way to counter the Shadreth's power. But tapping into it would require them to push their connection to its limits, and risk losing themselves in the process. One night, as they trained in the palace's meditation chamber, Erik felt a shift in the bond. It was as if the connection between them had deepened, threading through every fiber of his being. He opened his eyes to find the princess watching him, her gaze steady. "We're stronger than we were," she said. "But the Voidstream, it's like a storm on the horizon. I can feel it, Erik. It's coming." He reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We'll face it together. Whatever it takes." The next battle came sooner than they expected. The Shadreth launched a full-scale assault on the Cyrathian core worlds, their fleets darkening the skies like a plague. The Cyrathian forces were outmatched, even with Erik and the princess leading the charge. As the battle raged, Erik and the princess realized that the only way to turn the tide was to confront the Shadreth leader directly, a being known as the Voidcaller. Their bond would be their weapon, but wielding it against such a powerful foe could destroy them both. Standing in the command center, surrounded by chaos, the princess turned to Erik. "This might be the end," she said, her voice trembling. He took her hand, his grip firm. "Not if we have anything to say about it." And together, they plunged into the heart of the storm, their bond a beacon of hope in a galaxy teetering on the brink of destruction. The Cyrathian fleet was battered and broken, its ships scattered like debris in a storm. The Shadreth armada pressed its advantage, their dark vessels blotting out the stars. On the command deck of the Ecliptica, Erik and the princess prepared for their most dangerous mission yet, infiltrating the Shadreth flagship, the Void Spire. It was a colossal construct of twisted metal and pulsing red energy, hovering like a harbinger of doom in the center of the enemy fleet. "This isn't just a battle," the princess said, her voice firm but laced with trepidation. "If we fail to stop the Voidcaller, they'll destroy everything." Erik tightened the straps on his combat armor. The bond pulsed faintly in his mind, its warmth a constant reminder that he wasn't alone. "We won't fail," he said, his tone resolute. "Not as long as we're together." A strike team of Cyrathian elites accompanied them, their crystalline armor shimmering faintly in the dim light of the transport shuttle. The group was small but determined, their eyes filled with grim purpose as they braced for the mission ahead. The shuttle launched under the cover of a diversionary attack by the remaining Cyrathian fleet. Dodging streams of enemy fire, it weaved its way toward the Void Spire, cloaking its energy signature to avoid detection. Inside, the tension was palpable. The princess sat beside Erik, her hands gripping the edge of her seat. Through the bond, He felt her fear, but also her unwavering resolve. Reaching out, he placed a hand over hers. "We've got this," he said softly. She nodded, her gaze meeting his. "No matter what happens, Erik, thank you. For everything." He smirked. "Save the thank yous for after we win." The shuttle breached the Void Spire's outer defenses, landing in a docking bay swarming with Shadreth drones. The creatures were humanoid yet grotesque, their bodies an amalgamation of organic matter and twisted metal. The strike team wasted no time, cutting through the enemy ranks with precision as they secured the landing zone. Erik and the princess led the way, their bond guiding them through the labyrinthine corridors of the Void Spire. The air was thick with the hum of the Voidstream's energy, an oppressive presence that seemed to sap the strength of those unprepared for it. Erik felt it pressing against his mind, but the princess's presence kept him anchored. "They're trying to unnerve us," she said, her voice echoing faintly in his thoughts. "Stay focused. Always." The deeper they ventured into the Void Spire, the more surreal their surroundings became. The walls seemed to pulse with a heartbeat of their own, and shadows danced in ways that defied logic. The bond between Erik and the princess grew stronger with each step, their connection allowing them to anticipate threats before they appeared. As they approached the core of the ship, the Voidcaller's presence became undeniable. A voice, dark and insidious, slithered into their minds. "You are brave, little sparks," it said, its tone mocking. "But your defiance is futile. The Voidstream cannot be conquered. It consumes all." The princess's grip on Erik's arm tightened. "We're not here to conquer," she said aloud, her voice steady. "We're here to end your reign." The Voidcaller's laughter reverberated through the ship. "Then come, heirs of light. Let us see if your bond can withstand the darkness." The core chamber was a vast, cavernous space dominated by a swirling vortex of red and black energy, the Voidstream itself. At its center floated the Voidcaller, a figure cloaked in shadow and radiating an aura of malevolence. Its form was constantly shifting, as if it were made of the void it commanded. Erik and the princess stepped forward, the strike team holding back to secure the perimeter. The bond between them flared brightly, its light cutting through the oppressive darkness of the chamber. "You think your feeble connection can challenge me?" the Voidcaller sneered. "You are but sparks in an endless void." Erik drew his blade, its edge glowing faintly with the energy of the bond. "Sparks can start fires." The battle began with an explosion of power. The Voidcaller unleashed waves of energy that warped reality itself, twisting the chamber into a nightmarish kaleidoscope. Erik and the princess moved as one, their bond allowing them to anticipate the Voidcaller's attacks and counter with precision. The princess raised her hands, channeling the bond's energy into a shield that deflected a devastating surge of Voidstream energy. Erik lunged forward, his blade slicing through the shadows that surrounded the Voidcaller. Each strike seemed to weaken the entity, but its power was immense, and it retaliated with relentless fury. "You cannot win," the Voidcaller hissed. "The Voidstream is eternal. It will consume you." The princess faltered for a moment, the weight of the Voidstream pressing down on her. Erik felt her struggle through the bond and reached out, his voice steady and unwavering. "Stay with me," he said. "We're stronger together." Her resolve hardened, and she drew on the bond's energy, focusing it into a blinding surge of light that forced the Voidcaller back. The entity screamed, its form flickering as the bond's power overwhelmed it. But the Voidcaller was not finished. With a final, desperate attack, it unleashed a torrent of Voidstream energy that threatened to engulf them both. Erik and the princess stood their ground, combining their strength to create a barrier of light that pushed back against the darkness. "You may destroy me," the Voidcaller said, its voice a fading whisper. "But the Voidstream will remain. It will corrupt. It will consume." The bond flared one last time, its light piercing the heart of the Voidstream. The Voidcaller's form disintegrated, and the vortex began to collapse, its energy spiraling into nothingness. As the chamber fell silent, Erik and the princess stood together, their bond still glowing faintly. The Void Spire trembled, its structure beginning to break apart. "We need to get out of here," Erik said, his voice urgent. The strike team regrouped, and together they raced back to the shuttle. The Void Spire erupted in a brilliant explosion as they escaped, the remnants of the Shadreth fleet scattering in disarray. Back aboard the Ecliptica, the crew erupted into cheers as the news spread. The Shadreth had been defeated, their leader destroyed, and the Cyrathian Empire saved. Erik and the princess stood on the observation deck, watching the stars return to their rightful place in the void. "We did it," she said softly. He nodded, a small smile on his face. "Yeah. But I have a feeling this is just the beginning." She turned to him, her expression filled with gratitude and something deeper. "Whatever comes next, Erik, I'm glad it's with you." And as the stars stretched out before them, they knew their bond was more than a weapon. It was the foundation of a future they would build together. The victory over the Shadreth sent ripples across the galaxy, a story that would be told for generations. Erik and the princess became symbols of hope, their bond an example of unity that transcended boundaries. The Cyrathian Empire, once fractured and hesitant to embrace change, began to rebuild with a newfound purpose. Months after the battle, the Cyrathian capital was alive with celebration. The streets glowed with iridescent lights, and the air was filled with the hum of music and laughter. It was a festival to honor not only the victory but the resilience of their people. In the palace gardens, Erik stood in a quiet corner, watching the revelry from a distance. His warrior instincts hadn't dulled, but tonight, for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel at peace. "You're avoiding the party," the princess said, approaching him with a teasing smile. She wore a gown of shimmering silver that seemed to reflect the starlight, her uncovered face radiant with happiness. Erik chuckled. "I'm not much for big crowds. Besides, I figured you'd be busy with your adoring public." She stepped closer, her eyes soft. "They'll manage without me for a little while." The bond between them pulsed faintly, a constant reminder of their connection. Erik felt her joy and relief, but also a lingering sense of vulnerability. She had carried the weight of her people's hopes for so long, and though the burden had lessened, it had not disappeared. "Are you doing okay?" he asked, his tone gentle. She nodded, her gaze meeting his. "Better than I have in years. Because of you." He raised an eyebrow. "I think you're giving me too much credit." "No," she said firmly. "You've changed everything, Erik. You saw me when no one else would. You stood by me when I felt completely alone. And because of that, I'm not afraid anymore." Erik felt a warmth spread through him, the bond amplifying the emotions they shared. He reached out, taking her hand in his. "You gave me something too," he said. "A reason to fight beyond survival. A reason to believe in something bigger." They stood in silence for a moment, the noise of the celebration fading into the background. Around them, the garden seemed to shimmer with life, the crystalline plants glowing faintly in response to their presence. Finally, the princess broke the silence. "The council wants to make an official proclamation, to recognize our bond as a symbol of unity between our people." Erik smirked. "Does that mean I get a fancy title?" She laughed, the sound light and melodic. "Something like that. But it's more than just a title, Erik. They're finally ready to move forward, to accept that the old ways aren't enough anymore." "And you?" he asked, his tone soft. "What do you want?" Her expression turned serious, though her eyes were filled with warmth. "I want to face whatever comes next with you. As partners. As equals." Erik smiled, a rare, genuine expression that lit up his face. "I'd like that." The Proclamation Ceremony was held the next day, a grand event attended by dignitaries from across the galaxy. Erik and the princess stood together on the dais, their bond glowing faintly in the eyes of the crowd. The Emperor and Empress spoke of unity, resilience, and the strength found in the unlikeliest of alliances. When it was Erik's turn to speak, he kept it simple. "I'm just a soldier," he said, his voice steady. "But I've learned that strength isn't about fighting alone. It's about standing together, even when the odds seem impossible. That's what this bond represents. And that's what we'll keep fighting for." The crowd erupted into applause, the sound echoing through the palace. Erik glanced at the princess, who smiled at him with pride and affection. As the ceremony ended and the celebrations began anew, Erik and the princess slipped away to a quieter part of the palace. They stood together on a balcony overlooking the city, the lights below twinkling like stars. "What now?" Erik asked, his tone light but thoughtful. Now, the princess said, leaning against the railing, we rebuild. We forge alliances. We make sure the galaxy is ready for whatever comes next. And us? He asked, a hint of teasing in his voice. She turned to him, her expression soft. We keep walking this path together. Erik nodded, a sense of contentment settling over him. For the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The stars stretched endlessly before them, a reminder of the vastness of the galaxy and the endless possibilities that lay ahead. Together, they would face whatever challenges came their way, their bond a guiding light in the darkness. And for Erik and the princess, this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with hope, adventure, and the unbreakable strength of two hearts bound as one.